October 1931. Corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue. High noon. 3 Genovese men issued their ultimatum in public, loud enough for Harlem to hear. Stephanie St. Clair listened. Then she smiled. She had already started counting. Day 1 of 5. October 9, 1931. Harlem, New York. 12:14 p.m. The corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue was never quiet. Not at noon. Not on a Thursday. The sidewalks moved with the particular rhythm of a community that had learned to carry its dignity in motion. Women in church hats navigating the lunch hour, men in work coats moving between shifts, children weaving between legs with the freedom of those who don't yet know the city is not fully theirs. Fruit vendors called out prices. A streetcar ground its metal teeth against the tracks. Somewhere above the noise, a trumpet player practiced 3 floors up, his scales drifting down into the street like an announcement. Stephanie St. Clair heard all of it. She was walking south on Lenox Avenue when they stepped into her path. 3 men. Italian suits, expensive but worn with the particular carelessness of men who wanted you to know the expense without appreciating the tailoring. The one in front was broad across the shoulders, his hat pulled low enough to signal intent without hiding his face. The 2 behind him positioned themselves slightly to each side, not flanking exactly. Framing. The message in the geometry was clear. You are surrounded. The man in front spoke first. His name, known to those who tracked such things, was connected to the Genovese family's expanding interest in Manhattan's northernmost neighborhoods. He did not introduce himself. Men like him rarely did when the introduction was meant to be a threat. He told her, in plain language, that the numbers operation in Harlem, the routes, the runners, the drop houses, the entire infrastructure she had spent a decade constructing block by careful block, was no longer hers to operate. He told her she had 5 days to make arrangements for a transfer of the business. He told her the family was being generous with the timeline. He said all of this loudly. That was the point of it. Not the message, the volume. The sidewalk traffic on 125th Street did not stop, but it slowed. Eyes moved without heads turning. Ears angled toward the exchange with the practiced discretion of a community that had learned to witness carefully without appearing to watch. A woman adjusting a grocery bag near the fruit stand. A man who had been reading a newspaper who was no longer reading it. A teenager on a bicycle who had found a reason to pause. Harlem was watching. And 3 men in Italian suits, standing in the middle of Lenox Avenue at noon on a Thursday, had chosen that audience deliberately. Because the humiliation was not incidental to the message. The humiliation was the message. If Stephanie St. Clair could be made to look small in front of her own community, then she was already defeated before the 5 days had begun. That was the calculation. That was the strategy. It was not a good strategy. Stephanie stood still for a moment after the man finished speaking. 5 feet 7 inches tall in Cuban-heeled shoes, a charcoal wool coat fitted precisely at the waist, a string of pearls at her throat that caught what little October sun had broken through the cloud cover. Her face gave nothing. Not anger. Not fear. Not the performance of composure that fear produces when it is trying to disguise itself. Simply, nothing. The particular stillness of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do and is therefore no longer required to react. She looked at the man in front of her for exactly the length of time it takes to make someone uncertain. Then she stepped around him. No words. No visible acknowledgement that anything had been said, that any threat had been issued, that 3 men had positioned themselves in her path on the busiest corner in Harlem and announced the end of her empire. She walked south on Lenox Avenue and did not look back. By 1:07 p.m. she was at her desk at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill, 4th floor, windows facing west. The apartment was quiet in the particular way that expensive Harlem apartments were quiet in 1931. Thick walls, good plaster, the distant sound of the city muffled to something almost manageable. She uncapped her fountain pen. She placed a blank sheet of paper on the leather surface of the desk. And Stephanie St. Clair, who had crossed an ocean with nothing, who had built an empire from arithmetic and nerve, who had survived every attempt to diminish her that this city had produced across 19 years, began to write. Not a letter. A list. The names, addresses, and known associations of every vulnerability the Genovese family had exposed themselves to in Harlem. It was a long list. She had been keeping it for 2 years. Martinique. The island sat in the Caribbean Sea like a green wound, beautiful and colonized, lush and controlled, its people subject to the particular cruelty of French imperial administration that understood how to extract everything from a place while giving its people almost nothing in return. Stephanie St. Clair was born into that world. Into a household that understood labor intimately and ownership barely. Into a language, French Creole, that the colonizers considered inferior to their own, spoken by people they considered less than their own. She watched all of it with the eyes of someone who was already keeping score. What she inherited from Martinique was not poverty of mind. It was clarity. The clarity of someone who grows up watching the architecture of power from the outside, who learns before she learns anything else, that the rules governing who gets to have what are not natural laws. They are arrangements, made by people, and therefore breakable by people if you understand them precisely enough. She arrived in New York in 1912, 26 years old. The docks at Lower Manhattan received her the way they received most Caribbean immigrants in that era, with indifference shading towards suspicion, the machinery of American processing designed to remind you at every station that your presence was provisional. Ellis Island had its own grammar of dehumanization, the long lines, the medical inspections, the anglicization of names by clerks who couldn't be bothered with foreign syllables. Stephanie kept her name. She arrived in Harlem with $200, saved over years, protected across the ocean, carried in a cloth pouch sewn into the lining of her coat. $200 was not nothing in 1912. It was not enough either. But it was hers, entirely and completely, in a way that very little else was. Harlem in 1912 was in the middle of its transformation. The Great Migration had not yet reached its full momentum, but the current was already moving. Black families arriving from the South, Caribbean immigrants arriving from the islands, a community assembling itself in the blocks above 110th Street with the particular energy of people who have decided that here is where they will make something permanent. Jazz was threading itself through the culture. Churches were multiplying. Businesses were opening on Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue with the optimism of people who understood that ownership was the only real protection. Stephanie understood that too. She worked first in domestic service, the entry point that white New York provided for black women regardless of their intelligence or ambition, a ceiling disguised as a floor. She cleaned houses in Midtown and came home to Harlem on the streetcar, watching the city from the window with the careful attention of someone studying a system she intended to eventually master. She saved every dollar she could. She read every newspaper she could find. She asked questions of everyone she met who seemed to know something she didn't, about the city's informal economies, about who controlled what, about where the money actually moved in a Harlem that the formal banking system had largely decided to ignore. The numbers. That was what they called it. An illegal lottery, technically. Something far more complex, functionally. Here is how it worked. Every morning residents across Harlem placed small bets, a nickel, a dime, sometimes a quarter, on a 3-digit number. The winning number was determined by the last 3 digits of published financial figures, impossible to fix, publicly verifiable. Runners collected the slips and the money from homes, barbershops, beauty parlors, and street corners. The operation paid out $600 for every dollar bet on the winning number. Extraordinary odds in a community where the formal economy offered almost none. By the mid-1920s, the numbers racket was generating an estimated $30 million annually across Harlem. It was the neighborhood's largest employer. Its most reliable financial instrument. Its most democratic institution, because anyone could play, anyone could win, and the money stayed in the community rather than being extracted southward to white-owned banks that would not lend to black borrowers anyway. Stephanie St. Clair had been watching the numbers operation since 1917. By 1923 she had saved $10,000, accumulated across a decade of discipline so severe it bordered on monastic. She invested every dollar into building her own numbers operation. Not by taking over someone else's territory. By building infrastructure where none adequately existed. Reliable runners, accurate accounting, prompt payouts, and, critically, a reputation for honesty so absolute that in a business built on trust, her word became the standard everyone else was measured against. Within 3 years she was running numbers across 40 city blocks. By 1928, her operation was generating an estimated $200,000 per year, approximately $3.5 million in today's terms. She employed more than 150 runners, most of them Harlem residents who needed steady income in an era when white-owned businesses routinely refused to hire black workers regardless of qualification. She paid fairly. She paid on time. And she protected her people with a ferocity that became, over time, its own form of currency. She kept offices, quiet, unremarkable rooms and buildings on 136th Street and on 7th Avenue, where ledgers were maintained with the precision of a bank's accounting department. 3 separate record systems cross-referenced. Because Stephanie St. Clair had learned early that the only way to survive in a system designed to destroy you was to be more organized than everyone who wanted to see you fail. She also cultivated relationships that most operators in her position never bothered with. The editors of the New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's most widely read black newspaper, knew Stephanie St. Clair by name and by the envelopes she occasionally provided containing documented evidence of police corruption in the precinct districts that covered her territory. She never demanded coverage. She never threatened. She simply ensured that the paper's editors understood that she was a reliable source of accurate information, and that the community she served was their readership. That relationship would prove in time to be worth more than any gun. She also maintained careful, cultivated contacts inside the 28th Precinct and the 32nd Precinct, not through bribery which left you vulnerable but through information exchange. She knew which officers were honest, which were corrupt, and, most importantly, which corrupt officers were taking money from operators who might one day become her enemies. She filed this knowledge away the way a chess player catalogs positions. Not for immediate use. For the exact right moment. By 1931, Stephanie St. Clair was not simply a numbers operator. She was an institution. On Friday afternoons, her runners made deliveries that had nothing to do with lottery slips. Envelopes to families who couldn't make rent, payments to the grocer on behalf of households where the breadwinner had lost work, quiet contributions to the legal defense funds of Harlem residents arrested on charges that smelled, in her assessment, of police fabrication. Every Sunday morning she walked to Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street, the most prominent black church in America, and sat in the third row. She donated generously at collection. Not because she was performing piety. Because the church was the one institution in Harlem that held the community's moral center, and Stephanie St. Clair understood, with the strategic clarity that governed everything she did, that a woman who stood outside that center stood alone. She did not intend to stand alone. She had spent 19 years in Harlem ensuring she would never have to. This was what the 3 men in Italian suits had walked into on the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue on October 9, 1931. Not a woman. An architecture. A system of relationships, loyalties, information networks, and carefully maintained leverage that stretched from the church pews of 138th Street to the newsroom of the Amsterdam News to the filing cabinets of 2 police precincts. A structure that had taken 19 years and $10,000 and an ocean crossing and a decade of domestic service and the particular genius of a woman who had grown up watching how power worked from the outside, and had decided, somewhere in the middle of her life, that she was done watching. The Genovese family had sent 3 men to take what Stephanie St. Clair had built. They had sent them on a Thursday. By Thursday evening, she already knew more about their Harlem vulnerabilities than they knew about themselves. The clock was running. She had 4 days left. October 10, 1931. Day 2. 7:43 a.m. The drop house on 131st Street between Lenox and 5th Avenues was a narrow brownstone with a green door, one of 11 locations across Harlem where Stephanie's runners consolidated their morning collections before the accounting began. It had operated without incident for 4 years. The building's superintendent, a quiet man named Clarence Webb who had worked for Stephanie since 1927, arrived that morning to find the green door standing open. Inside, overturned furniture. Broken glass. The metal lockbox where the morning's early slips were stored had been pried from the wall and taken. The message written in grease pencil on the back wall was not in English, but its meaning required no translation. Clarence Webb did not call the police. He called Stephanie. She arrived at 131st Street at 8:15 a.m., walked through the door, surveyed the room for 90 seconds and left. She did not raise her voice. She did not instruct anyone to retaliate. She told Clarence Webb to close the location for the day, redirect the morning's runners to the backup collection point on 134th Street, and say nothing to anyone outside the organization about what had happened. Then she went home and added a line to the list she had started the previous afternoon. On the surface, Stephanie St. Clair appeared to be absorbing damage. That was precisely what she intended them to think. October 11, 1931. Day 3. 11:20 a.m. 3 of her runners, Winston Pace on the 128th Street route, a young woman named Dorothy Sims who covered the blocks around 7th Avenue, and an older man known on the street as Sugar Ray Tibbs who had worked Stephanie's Lenox corridor since 1925, were approached within a 4-hour window by the same 2 men. The men were not subtle. They identified themselves by implication, referenced the family they represented, and delivered a consistent message: stop working, go home, find other employment. The 5-day deadline applied to the runners as much as to their employer. Winston Pace was 23 years old, 6 feet tall, and had been feeding his mother and 2 younger sisters on Stephanie's wages since 1929. He listened to the 2 men with the careful stillness of someone performing calm he did not feel. Dorothy Sims was 31, a former schoolteacher from Georgia who had come north in 1926 and found that New York's teaching positions were no more available to black women than Georgia's had been. She had worked for Stephanie for 3 years. When the men approached her on 7th Avenue, she told them, with the measured precision of a woman who had once taught grammar to reluctant children, that she would convey their message to the appropriate party. Sugar Ray Tibbs, who was 54 and had seen enough of New York's informal power structures to qualify as a historian, said nothing at all. He finished his route. He delivered his slips. And that evening he appeared at Stephanie's door on Edgecombe Avenue and gave her a complete description of both men: height, build, accent, the specific ring on the left hand of the taller one, the make of the automobile they were driving. Stephanie added 3 more lines to her list. The Genovese family's calculation was not unintelligent. It was simply wrong. They had assessed the situation through a framework that made internal sense to them. A framework built from decades of operating in a world where the response to pressure was either submission or counter-pressure, where the parties involved were men, where the relevant currency was the credible threat of physical violence, and where a woman operating an illegal business in Harlem was, by the logic of that framework, a provisional power at best. Their intelligence on Stephanie St. Clair, such as it was, had told them she was successful, established, possibly difficult to dislodge. But the intelligence had been gathered by men who had spoken to other men, and those men had filtered what they heard through the same framework, and so what arrived at the family's decision-making table was a portrait of a numbers operator who happened to be a woman, rather than a portrait of what Stephanie actually was: a strategist who happened to run numbers. The distinction was everything. A numbers operator, threatened with superior force, has limited options: negotiate, submit, or fight, and lose badly because force against force favors the party with more of it. A strategist, threatened with superior force, has a different set of options entirely. Because a strategist is not primarily interested in the force being applied. A strategist is interested in the vulnerabilities of the party applying it. And the Genovese family, in choosing to expand into Harlem in the autumn of 1931, had exposed vulnerabilities they did not know Stephanie had been cataloging. October 11, 1931. Day 3. 9:47 p.m. She sat at her desk with the window open despite the October cold, the sounds of Sugar Hill at night coming in with the draft, a radio program from a neighbor's apartment, the distant percussion of someone's heels on the sidewalk below, the low negotiation of wind through the gaps in the window frame. In front of her, the list, now filling a second page. And for a moment, just a moment, in the privacy of her 4th-floor apartment with no one watching and nothing to perform, Stephanie St. Clair allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was carrying. She was 45 years old. She had built everything she owned from $200 and 19 years of discipline in a city that had offered her, at every turn, the precise minimum required to keep her from leaving. She had no husband. No partner of comparable standing. No peer in the truest sense. No other woman in Harlem or in New York who occupied the position she occupied and could therefore understand what it cost to hold it. If this went wrong, if her calculation was off by a degree, if one of the 3 levers she was preparing to pull failed to engage, the consequences would not fall only on her. They would fall on Clarence Webb and his family on 131st Street. On Winston Pace and his mother and sisters. On Dorothy Sims, who had come north looking for a better version of the life the South had denied her. On the 150 runners and their dependents, and the families who received the Friday envelopes, and the legal defense fund contributions and the church donations. She had built a kingdom. But kingdoms were not abstractions. They were people. And the people were counting on her to be right. She sat with that weight for exactly as long as she could afford to. Then she picked up her fountain pen. She turned to a fresh page. And she began to write the second document, the one that would not be a list of vulnerabilities but a sequence. A precise, ordered, timed sequence of actions that would need to be executed across the next 48 hours with the coordination of a military operation and the deniability of an ordinary week in Harlem. Day 4 was tomorrow. She intended to use every hour of it. October 12, 1931. Day 4. 5:30 a.m. Harlem did not sleep so much as it shifted registers. The night crowd thinning on Lenox Avenue, the jazz from the after-hours clubs fading to a murmur, the first delivery trucks beginning their routes through streets still dark enough to belong to the previous day. At 409 Edgecombe Avenue, the fourth-floor apartment had been lit since before 4 o'clock. Stephanie St. Clair had not slept. She had worked. The second document, the sequence she had begun drafting the previous night, now covered 4 pages in her precise, economical handwriting. Not a plan in the way that word is commonly understood. Not a list of intentions. A mechanism. Interlocking parts, each dependent on the others, each time to the others, designed so that when the first piece moved, the rest would follow with the inevitability of a clock that has already been wound. She read it through once more, made 2 small corrections and folded it into the inside pocket of her coat. Then she picked up the telephone. The first call went to James Hicks. Hicks was a staff writer at the New York Amsterdam News, the most widely read black newspaper in America, with a circulation that reached across Harlem and into every conversation that mattered in the community. He was 32 years old, careful, and professionally ambitious in the way that talented black journalists of that era had to be careful. And ambitious simultaneously, understanding that the stories most worth telling were also the stories most likely to bring institutional pressure down on the people who told them. Stephanie had provided James Hicks with accurate, documented information on 3 previous occasions. Each time, the story had proven out exactly as she had represented it. He trusted her the way journalists trust sources who have never been wrong. Completely, and with the particular wariness of someone who understands that a source this reliable is also a source with purpose. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough. She told him that within 48 hours she would be able to provide him with documented evidence of a pattern of financial arrangements between Genovese-connected operators and at least one city official whose name she would supply at the appropriate time. She told him the story was front page. She told him she needed him to hold space for it in Thursday's edition, 2 days from now, and to be reachable by telephone on Wednesday evening. Hicks asked one question. Stephanie answered it. The call lasted 4 minutes. She hung up and made the second call. The second call required more preparation than a telephone could provide. For this one, she dressed carefully, the charcoal wool coat, the pearls, dark gloves, and took the streetcar downtown at 6:45 a.m., before the morning rush had fully assembled, sitting near the window and watching the city scroll past with the outward calm of a woman going to an unremarkable appointment. The man she was going to see was not a criminal. He was a federal investigator, a mid-level agent attached to the Treasury Department's New York field office, a man named Gerald Foley who had been quietly building a file on Genovese family financial operations in Manhattan for 14 months. Foley was Irish, methodical, and possessed of the particular professional frustration of an investigator who knows exactly what is happening but cannot yet prove it to the standard required for action. Stephanie had known about Foley's investigation for 6 months. She had known about it because one of her informants, a bookkeeper at a midtown accounting firm that handled certain financial arrangements for Genovese-adjacent businesses, had mentioned in passing that a federal agent had been asking questions. Stephanie had identified the agent, learned his name and his specific area of investigation, and filed the information away with the same patient precision she applied to everything. She had not approached Foley then. She was approaching him now. She did not go to his office. She went to the diner on Worth Street where, according to information she had gathered over the preceding weeks, he ate breakfast on Monday and Wednesday mornings. She arrived at 7:20 a.m., sat 2 tables away, ordered coffee and waited. Foley arrived at 7:31 a.m. She gave him 8 minutes to settle, then carried her coffee to his table and sat down across from him without asking. He looked up, assessed her, started to speak. She placed a manila envelope on the table between them. Inside the envelope, 3 months of documented financial transactions connecting a Genovese family intermediary to a payments arrangement with an aide in the office of a Manhattan city councilman. The documents had been assembled by Stephanie's bookkeeper contact over the course of several weeks, copied carefully, and stored in a safe house in Brooklyn until this morning. They were not complete. They did not constitute a prosecutable case on their own. But they were real, they were accurate, and they pointed, with unmistakable clarity, toward a thread that a motivated federal investigator could pull. Foley looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Stephanie drank her coffee. She told him, quietly, without drama, in the measured cadence she used when she wanted to be heard precisely, that she had additional documentation available. That its release was contingent on a specific outcome she would describe. That she was not asking for immunity, protection, or any arrangement that required him to compromise his investigation. She was offering him a gift. The only thing she asked in return was that he use it. Foley asked how she had obtained the documents. Stephanie told him that was not a question that served either of them. He looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man recalibrating, adjusting his understanding of what kind of conversation he was in. Then he picked up the envelope and placed it inside his jacket. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Stephanie left first. She was back in Harlem by 10:15 a.m. The third lever was the most delicate, and she had saved it for last because it required not a contact or a document but a performance, the kind of precise social engineering that could not be rushed and could not be faked. The meeting scheduled for 118th Street. She had learned of it 4 days before the Genovese men had approached her on Lenox Avenue, which meant she had known about the threat before it was delivered, and had therefore been preparing her response before the clock officially started. This was not coincidence. This was the product of an intelligence network that her enemies had never taken seriously because they could not conceive of a woman building one. The meeting was between two Genovese-connected figures and a Harlem numbers operator named Calvin Briggs, a man who had operated a small numbers route on the east side of Lenox for 3 years, who had always existed at the margins of Stephanie's territory, and who had, apparently, decided that the Genovese family's arrival presented an opportunity for personal advancement. Calvin Briggs was going to deliver intelligence about Stephanie's operation to the family. Route locations, runner schedules, drop house addresses, the kind of operational detail that would make a takeover significantly cleaner. He did not know that Stephanie knew this. She had known for 72 hours. She did not move against Briggs directly. Not because she was incapable of it, but because direct action against a man who had already agreed to meet with the Genovese family would alert the family that her intelligence network was more extensive than they had imagined, and she needed them to remain, for exactly 48 more hours, in the comfortable assumption that she was simply a woman absorbing pressure. Instead, she sent a message, not to Briggs, to the meeting itself, through a carefully constructed chain of communication, delivered verbally, never written, passing through 3 intermediaries who each knew only their own link. She ensured that the Genovese family's contact for the 118th Street meeting received a single piece of information, that the meeting location had been compromised, and that federal surveillance of Genovese financial operations in Harlem had been active for the past 2 weeks. The meeting on 118th Street was canceled by the family's side before noon. Calvin Briggs spent the afternoon waiting in an empty room. October 12, 1931. Day 4. 4 p.m. Stephanie returned to Edgecombe Avenue as the afternoon light was going copper over Sugar Hill, the October sun making the brownstones glow briefly before it gave up and let the evening come. She hung her coat. She made tea. She sat at her desk and reviewed the sequence document one more time, checking each element against what the day had accomplished. James Hicks, confirmed. The Amsterdam news story was positioned and ready. Gerald Foley, confirmed. The federal thread had been handed to someone with both the motivation and the authority to pull it. The 118th Street meeting, cancelled. Calvin Briggs was neutralized without being touched. 3 levers, all engaged. All pointed toward the same moment, Thursday morning, when the 5-day deadline expired and the Genovese family would expect either Stephanie's surrender or her silence. They were going to receive neither. She thought about the men in their suits on the corner of 125th Street. The volume of the ultimatum. The audience they had chosen. The calculation that public humiliation would produce private submission. She picked up her pen and drew a single line through the sequence document's final item. There was one thing left to prepare. Not a phone call. Not a meeting. Not a document. A message. Personal. Precise. Delivered directly to the Genovese intermediary who had served as the family's communication channel since day one. It would go out tomorrow morning. And it would tell them, without ambiguity, without threat, without a single raised voice, exactly how much she knew, exactly how long she had known it, and exactly what Thursday morning was going to look like for everyone in the room who had underestimated her. Day 5 was 16 hours away. Stephanie St. Clair went to bed at 9 p.m. She slept without difficulty. October 13, 1931. Day 5. 5 a.m. She was dressed before the sun came up. Charcoal wool coat. Pearl necklace. Dark gloves. The same clothes she had worn to Worth Street 2 days earlier, not from lack of options, but from the particular deliberateness of a woman who understood that repetition carried its own message. She was not dressing for the occasion. She was dressing for the record. Whatever this day produced, she intended to have been exactly herself throughout it. The apartment was still. The sequence document, 4 pages, 2 corrections, now read so many times she no longer needed it, sat folded on the corner of her desk. She did not take it with her. She did not need to. Every item on it was already in motion, already irreversible, already beyond the point where the Genovese family could intercept or redirect what was coming. She made coffee. She stood at the west-facing window and drank it slowly, watching Sugar Hill emerge from the dark ingredients, the brownstones first, then the street below, then the specific quality of a Harlem morning that she had watched from this window for years and never taken for granted. Not once. At 5:47 a.m., she picked up the telephone and made one final call. To James Hicks at the Amsterdam News. For words, run it as discussed. Hicks said he would. She hung up. The first envelope had already left her hands. She had prepared it the previous evening, a legal-sized manila envelope, sealed with wax, addressed in her handwriting to Gerald Foley at the Treasury Department's Worth Street office. Inside, the second tranche of financial documentation her bookkeeper contact had assembled. More complete than the first. More precise. 3 additional months of transaction records, 2 additional names and a handwritten cover note, unsigned, that explained, in the economical language she used when she wanted to be understood without ambiguity, the organizational structure connecting the transactions to the Genovese family's Harlem expansion effort. A courier she trusted, a young man named Robert Ellis who had worked her organization's administrative errands since 1929, had delivered it to a drop point at 4:30 a.m. From there, it would reach Foley's desk before he arrived at his office. You would find it waiting. The second envelope was the Amsterdam News. James Hicks had spent 2 days constructing the story from the documentation Stephanie had provided in their 5:30 a.m. telephone call on day 4, supplemented by his own reporting, interviews with Harlem business owners who had been approached by Genovese-connected men in recent weeks, a statement from a 32nd precinct source who confirmed unusual activity in the neighborhood, and the financial documentation itself, described in the story with enough specificity to be credible without exposing the precise source. The headline, as Hicks had read it to her on Wednesday evening for her approval, was measured and precise in the way that the Amsterdam News understood its readership required. A community that had learned to read between lines, that did not need sensationalism because the facts, accurately reported, were already extraordinary. Italian interests move on Harlem numbers. Community operators report intimidation campaign. It would be on newsstands across Harlem by 7 a.m. The third envelope was the one that mattered most. October 13, 1931. 6:15 a.m. The Genovese family's intermediary in Harlem, the man who had served as the communication channel between the family and Stephanie since the ultimatum on day 1, lived in a rooming house on 119th Street, 3 blocks from the cancelled meeting location. His name was not widely known in Harlem. He preferred it that way. Stephanie knew it. She knew his address, his morning routine, the name of the woman who ran the rooming house, and the specific time, 6:20 a.m. nearly every morning, at which he collected his newspaper from the front stoop. At 6:18 a.m., a sealed envelope appeared on that stoop, placed there by Robert Ellis on his way back from the Worth Street drop. Inside the envelope, a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No signature. Written in Stephanie's hand, in the clean declarative sentences she used when she wanted there to be no possibility of misinterpretation. It listed the 118th Street meeting, address, date, time, and the names of both Genovese-connected attendees who had been expected. It listed Gerald Foley's name, his title, and a precise description of the documentation that had now reached his desk on 2 separate occasions. It listed the Amsterdam News headline, word for word. And at the bottom, separated from the rest by a single line, it said this: "The deadline was yours. The outcome is mine. I suggest you communicate that distinction to the appropriate people before noon. No threat. No demand. No request for negotiation or acknowledgement or response. Simply the facts, arranged in the order that made their meaning inescapable." October 13, 1931. 7 a.m. The Amsterdam News hit Harlem's newsstands. By 7:30 a.m., copies were being read at the counter of every barbershop and beauty parlor on Lenox Avenue. By 8 a.m., the story had traveled, the way stories travel in communities built on oral communication, faster than print, wider than distribution, through the churches and the corner stores and the numbers pickup points and the building superintendent networks that formed the invisible connective tissue of Harlem's daily life. Harlem understood immediately what the story meant. Not because the story said everything. It didn't. But because Harlem had been watching since the corner of 125th Street on October 9th, and Harlem had seen the green door on 131st Street standing open, and Harlem had seen Winston Pace and Dorothy Sims and Sugar Ray Tibbs approached on their routes, and Harlem had been waiting, with the particular patient attention of a community that has learned to read situations that are not being reported to them, to see what Stephanie St. Clair was going to do about it. Now they knew. She had not fired a shot. She had not threatened anyone. She had not moved a single visible piece on the board until every invisible piece was already in position. And then she had moved all of them at once. October 13, 1931. 11:20 a.m. The intermediary on 119th Street sent a message. Not to Stephanie directly. Through the same chain of communication she had used to cancel the 118th Street meeting, 3 intermediaries, verbal only, no paper. The message was brief. The family was reconsidering its position regarding Harlem operations. Stephanie received the message at 11:34 a.m. She was at her desk. She read it twice. Then she set it aside, opened her ledger, and began reviewing the week's numbers accounting, the ordinary administrative work of running an operation that had just successfully defended itself against the largest organized crime family in Manhattan. She did not celebrate. She did not call anyone. She did not allow herself the luxury of relief, because relief implied that doubt had existed, and she could not afford even in private to have operated on doubt. She had operated on information, on preparation, on the compounded interest of 2 years of cultivated relationships and carefully stored intelligence, deployed at the precise moment when deployment would produce maximum effect with minimum exposure. The Genovese family had sent 3 men to take what she built. They had sent them on a Thursday. They were reconsidering their position on a Tuesday. 5 days. No shots fired. No runners hurt. No territory surrendered. October 18, 1931. Sunday. 10:45 a.m. Abyssinian Baptist Church. 138th Street. The sanctuary filling with the particular warmth of a Sunday morning congregation. The rustle of good coats, the low organ prelude, the specific quality of light through stained glass that made everything inside look slightly more permanent than the world outside. Stephanie St. Clair walked in and took her seat. 3rd row. She bowed her head. When the collection plate came around, she gave generously, as she always did, without display, without announcement, the way she did most things that mattered. After the service, an older woman from the congregation touched her arm in the vestibule. Said nothing. Simply nodded once. The nod of someone who reads newspapers, who understands what they mean, who wanted Stephanie to know that the community had been watching and the community had seen. Stephanie nodded back. Then she walked out into the October morning, turned south on 7th Avenue and went home. The Genovese family never came back to Harlem for Stephanie St. Clair. Not in November. Not in December. Not in the years that followed, when the family continued expanding its operations across Manhattan with the methodical appetite of an organization that understood patience as a virtue, except, apparently, when the cost of patience in a particular territory exceeded the value of the territory itself. That calculation, applied to Harlem in the autumn of 1931, produced a result that surprised everyone who did not understand what Stephanie had built, and confirmed everything for everyone who did. The 2 Genovese-connected men who had escalated the pressure campaign on days 2 and 3, the men who had vandalized the 131st Street Drophouse, who had approached Winston Pace and Dorothy Sims and Sugar Ray Tibbs on their routes, were not seen in Harlem again after October 15. They did not announce their departure. They did not send word. They simply ceased to be present, the way problems cease to be present when the people responsible for them have been made to understand that continuation is no longer viable. The intermediary on 119th Street vacated his rooming house by the end of the month. Calvin Briggs, who had arranged to deliver Stephanie's operational intelligence to a meeting that never happened, quietly abandoned his Lenox Avenue numbers route in early November and relocated to Philadelphia. He did not say goodbye to anyone in Harlem. He understood, without being told, that his continued presence in the neighborhood represented a problem that Stephanie St. Clair had chosen, so far, not to solve, and that her continued restraint was a courtesy, not a permanent condition. Gerald Foley's investigation at the Treasury Department continued. Stephanie never contacted him again. She didn't need to. She had given him what he needed and pointed him in the direction he was already trying to go. What he did with it was his business. What it cost the Genovese family's Manhattan financial arrangements over the following 18 months was, from Stephanie's perspective, a natural consequence of decisions they had made themselves. She had simply ensured those decisions had consequences. What happened in Harlem after October 13, 1931, was quieter than the events that preceded it, and more important. The numbers operation returned to full capacity within a week. The 131st Street Drophouse reopened with a new door, painted the same green as the old one, a detail Stephanie had specified herself because the color was not incidental. It was a statement. Everything is as it was. Everything remains mine. Winston Pace went back to his route on 128th Street. Dorothy Sims went back to 7th Avenue. Sugar Ray Tibbs, who had given Stephanie the ring description and the automobile make that had helped her confirm the family's operational patterns in Harlem, received a bonus in his Friday envelope that he never mentioned to anyone and never forgot. The Amsterdam news story circulated for weeks after its publication, picked up in conversation, referenced in church, discussed in the barbershops and beauty parlors where Harlem processed its own history in real time. It became part of the neighborhood's understanding of itself. Proof of something the community had always believed but rarely seen demonstrated so cleanly, that intelligence, applied with precision and patience, was a more durable form of power than anything that came in through a door with its fists up. Bumpy Johnson was 26 years old in October 1931. He had been working for Stephanie for less than a year, observant, capable, still learning the architecture of the operation he had been hired to help protect. He watched the 5 days unfold from the inside. He watched Stephanie make the calls, send the envelopes, cancel the meeting without touching it, and walk into church on Sunday morning as though the preceding week had been unremarkable. He would later be credited, by history, by Hollywood, by the mythology that accumulates around men who operate in visible spaces, as the strategic genius of Harlem's criminal organization. The record is more complicated than that. The foundation he built on, the networks he inherited, the understanding of leverage over violence that defined his best decisions, these did not originate with Bumpy Johnson. They originated with the woman who employed him. Stephanie St. Clair continued operating in Harlem through the 1930s and into the 1940s, surviving Dutch Schultz's far more violent takeover attempt later in the decade, surviving multiple arrests that never produced the convictions her enemies hoped for, surviving the Depression, surviving the particular daily attrition of being a black Caribbean immigrant woman in a city that had never fully decided to recognize her existence as legitimate. She used the newspapers when she needed them. She used the courts when she needed them. She used silence when silence was the sharpest instrument available. She retired in the early 1960s. She died in 1969 at the age of 83, in Harlem, where she had arrived with $200 and a clarity of purpose that the city had spent 57 years failing to diminish. She was not given a state funeral. No street in Harlem bears her name. No official history of New York's organized crime era places her at the center of the story she inhabited and, in several critical moments, determined. But Harlem remembered. The women who ran the numbers pickup routes remembered. The families who received the Friday envelopes remembered. The congregation at Abyssinian Baptist Church, 3rd row, remembered. James Hicks at the Amsterdam News remembered. Winston Pace and Dorothy Sims and Sugar Ray Tibbs remembered. And the Genovese family, which sent 3 men to take what she built on a Thursday in October 1931 and reconsidered its position by the following Tuesday, remembered in the way that organizations remember lessons that cost them something. They never came back. In her later years, Stephanie St. Clair was known to say, not often, not loudly, in the economical way she said everything that mattered, that the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could be was prepared. Not armed. Not violent. Not feared in the way that men sought to be feared. Prepared. Because preparation meant you had already lived through the threat before it arrived. It meant the outcome was not determined by the moment of confrontation but by the months and years of work that preceded it. It meant that when 3 men in Italian suits stepped into your path on the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue and told you that everything you had built was no longer yours, you could afford to smile. Because you had already started counting. And you already knew how it ended.